Awesome. We are live. So, good morning, Maya. This is one of our first product management workshops. My name is Key or Cannablich. So, I lead the product team at Developer DAO. And we are currently building out our product community. So, this is the first of many workshops that we'll be having in the future around product management. I'm just excited to have Maya here today. I met Maya at Black Tech Retreat last month, I believe.
hmm
And you had a very inspiring story of how you kind of got into product and also how you got into Web3 and started working at blockchain companies. So I was really inspired by your story and just kind of your
Thank you.
tenacity. So that's why I really invited you here today to kind of talk about your experiences. So if you want to get started with a quick intro, yeah, we can get started.
Sure. So thank you everyone who's tuning in. So today's presentation is going to be about localization and Web3. I'm happy to take any questions at any point. Um, uh, so let's start off by introducing myself. So my name is Maya Cadell. But who is Maya Cadell, right? So I've helped companies expand into MENA, Southeast Asia, East Africa, and West Africa. And so, if I'm to break down that experience of what I have actually done, so I built a non-custodial on and off ramping protocol for Africa that is a peer-to-peer protocol. I'm sure some of you will wonder what is a peer-to-peer on and off ramp. Don't worry, that's coming later on in the presentation. So just hold your thoughts and questions for a moment. I also worked at a Southeast Asian conglomerate, helping them to invest and expand into new sectors across Southeast Asia. So that was anything from the drone sector to mobile commerce to health tech to car hire and any and everything in between. And I also worked at one of the largest African neobanks and helped them expand into Kenya. And I was actually the second member on their Kenyan team. I've consulted a telecom about building mobile money products for the Muslim community in Tanzania. And that's quite nuanced because then you have to think about having Sharia compliant financial products or mobile money products as well. And then most recently, I launched a tech unicorn into MENA and the Arabic speaking world by launching Arabic across all of our products and platforms. And that was our first right to left language that we'd ever had. So apart from all of that, on the side, I'm a very, very active venture scout, and my whole mission is connecting African startups to foreign investors. So I've scouted some of the more notable deals. In the African tech scene in the last year. So the crypto ones are Mara, Afropolitan DAO, and Nestcoin, where I currently work. And if at any point, you have any further questions that I can't answer in the context of this 1 hour, please feel free to find me on Twitter at Cadell Maya. I am the only one with my name, so I should be easy to find. But let's get into it now. So I'm going to start off with a controversial statement, if that's okay. Um, so if we truly want to cross the crypto chasm, we have to think and talk about crypto beyond the English speaking West. So a lot of people, say, okay, Web3 crypto, it's meant to, or fundamentally, it decentralizes and democratizes ownership and access. And so, it's global. And yes, don't get me wrong, Web3 is miles ahead of what we typically have. But then what usually happens is people go, okay, Web3 tick. And then they think about the problem space that applies to typically the English speaking West or their specific market. And then go, okay, and now it's global. No, no, no. That's not correct. It's a poor assumption to have. And I'm sure many of us are guilty of it. And so this presentation, this workshop is meant to challenge and make you think of ways in which you can prevent that thought process from occurring. And here's actually the real controversial statement. So in my opinion, most utility for crypto is in emerging markets. In the developed world, what we see is people are engaging in crypto in the form of speculation or ideology. And those two things alone are, in my opinion, are likely to be the thing that help us truly cross the chasm and that help crypto truly go to the masses. And also, more importantly, in the context of an economic crisis, which many countries around the world are on the brink of, if not already entered into, those are luxuries we cannot afford. And so I'm sure there's some of you watching thinking, no, what on earth is she on about? Or you may disagree. But I want you to suspend your judgment for one moment, and let me show you some data that may help you think otherwise, or may at least help you think that even if Maya is 1% correct, let me pay attention. Let me actually think about localization when it comes to Web3. So the key data: 6.6 billion people live in emerging markets. That's over 85% of the global population. Only 4.6% of the global population speaks English as their first language. And to talk about a continent that's very close to my heart, in Africa, 1 in 6 of the global internet users will be in Africa by 2025. So that means by you thinking and building from an English speaking Western perspective, you are ignoring 6.6 billion people. You're ignoring about almost, well, 95% of the global population, and you're ignoring you're ignoring, yeah, pretty much like 1 in 6 global internet users. So hopefully that convinces you that localization in Web3 is key. So now let's actually go into what localization means, and let's define the key terms to begin with. So, locale. So I was a bit cheeky by just using the term localization because there's actually 3 key terms that you should understand. So firstly, locale. Locale refers to language, cultural, and other requirements of a specific target market. Then we have internationalization, or which is commonly referred to as I-18N, which refers to designing and developing your product so it can be adapted and localized to different cultures, regions, and languages. And then finally, we have localization, L10N, which is actually adapting your product to meet the language, culture, and other requirements of each locale. And so the key difference between internationalization and localization is internationalization is having the ability for your product to react dynamically to where your user is, like what market they're in, what language they use, what currency they use, and other cultural requirements. Whereas localization is the actual adaptation. So it's actually saying, okay, our user is sitting in France, and so we need to make sure that our French language is top notch. We need to make sure that we are showing them euro as a currency, etc. And all these definitions come from or are an adaptation of definitions from W3C. Now, W3C is one of the main international standard organizations for the internet, and they've written quite a lot about locale, internationalization, and localization as well. So let's actually get into it, right? Localization, what should I be thinking about when it comes to building a Web3 product? So we're going to go through a few things. We're going to look at locale and language, design, on and off ramping, app sizes and data, positioning, and the value of money. So firstly, locale and languages. So when we think of localization, languages is one of the first things that people think about. And that's not incorrect. It is an important aspect, but it's not the only aspect. And we'll come on to what else is included in localization in a moment. So when we think of languages, the key thing is your translation process. And there's different ways you can approach translation. So one way is machine translation, another is human translation, and then the third is a mix. So machine translation. Machine translation is generally, if you use, for example, Google Translate, that's machine translation. And Google, in fact, when it comes to even companies and platforms having machine translation as part of their product, Google does generally have a monopoly in this arena. But there are other machine translators and other machine translation engines. In fact, some agencies which do the human translation even have their own machine translation agencies that you can use. But if you want to get an overview of different machine translators, In10 is really good at providing a good review of what you can use and what works for your specific needs. Now, when it comes to machine translation, you can approach it by automatically translating all of the content so that when someone lands on your platform, on your app, etc., it's all in their local language. Or you can have it that the user has to click to translate the content, and you can do this in certain sections as well, rather than just everything. The latter, of course, is cheaper because you're only paying when it's actually translated. Um, when it also comes to machine translation, you can think about having personalized machine translation engines. And this is when the engine is trains using your data from and your content. And so the point is that it should become more personalized over time and accurate in translating for your specific needs and use cases. If you do use something like this, you of course have to make sure you have someone managing the engine itself. And one thing I want you to go away with is that not all machine translations are created equal. So, for example, Japanese tends not to be as accurate when it comes to machine translation, and it also varies. The success varies depending on the origin language. So, for example, if you're going from English to Hindi, it's likely to be more accurate of a translation than going from Japanese to Hindi, as an example. So that's machine translation. Then we have human translation. So human translation is is what it says, right? You have humans translating, and there's different ways you can approach this. You can have people within your company focused on human translation. You can have freelancers focused on human translation. You could also hire an agency. And which one you goes with really depends upon your needs and your desires. The general advice or tendency is, though, is if there's a key market that's really important to you, you should have either agency or dedicated freelancers or someone internal. You should really push the human translation. Um, One thing to think about is when you're doing human translation is make sure you're testing the handoff process. And so by that I mean you give the content to be translated, they translate it, and how does it get back to you and dynamically into your product and platform. And also think about handoff time. So whatever you do, make sure you do a trial period with whoever you're using. And then the final way to approach translation is to have a mixed approach. So how you mix it is up to you. One general thing is that when it comes to mixing and having machine translation within something that you also have human translation, is you usually use machine translation for less important or visible content, or if there's user generated content which is changing rapidly. So that's languages. We've now got the obvious out of the way, and let's actually think about the nuanced aspects of localization and internationalization in Web3. So locale. So as I was saying, localization and internationalization is about far more than just the language. There's also a lot of cultural nuances that you have to take into account. And cultural nuances come into play even within English speaking countries. So if you think about it, in the UK, I'm from London, we present time using we're more comfortable using digital clock, 24-hour clock. In the US, they're less so. So they use AM, PM, analog, etc. And there's even specific phrases that vary and have very different meaning, even amongst English speaking countries. Then there's also currencies. So I use GBP. That's a currency I think about. And one of the challenges in Web3 is everything tends to be by default quoted in USD. And there's not always an option to even convert and think about it in your local currency. And GBP, I mean, we're going through a rough time at the moment, but it's not a obscure, unknown currency. So imagine for people from other markets. And these things are really important because when it comes to crypto and Web3, which is still relatively new and people are still slightly apprehensive of, we want to make it as easy for people as possible. We want to reduce the mental bandwidth or load that they have to use to engage with the cryptoverse or Web3 as a whole. And so when you have it in USD by default and not to someone's local currency, it means that someone has to convert to USD and then think again, right? So there's two mental steps. And so these things really do matter and can make a huge difference. Another thing when you think about currencies, there's also many dollars, right? And this is where ISO codes can come into handy. So an ISO code is a three-letter code referring to a currency, and every currency has a unique ISO code. So USD is the ISO code for US dollars. GBP is an ISO code for pound sterling. And the important thing is that be careful with defining and how you represent USD or dollars rather, because you don't want a situation where someone, let's say, is sitting in Singapore where they also have Singaporean dollars, or Hong Kong where they have dollars, or Australia where they also have dollars, and think that they're paying in their local currency only to later find out that they've actually been charged in US dollars. So be mindful of presentation as well. And the point is, these small things do have huge ramifications, make a huge difference. Then there's symbols and imagery. So this is really important because, for example, whilst popping a champagne bottle has celebratory connotations attached to it in the West, in Islamic countries, that's not a symbol that they would use to represent necessary celebration. Um, and so you want to think about your imagery you use and whether that's applicable or conscious and respective to other cultural nuances. And even the imagery kind of plays into how we design and think about NFTs, right? Are our NFTs scalable to other markets, other cultures, etc.? Timestamps I've kind of alluded to, but 24-hour clock versus analog. And linked to that, don't forget there are other numerical systems. So 1, 2, 3 is just one numerical system. There are plenty others that people engage with. Colors is another factor. So red in the West means stop. It means anger. It doesn't necessarily have the best connotations. Where in Asia, it's a good thing. It means luck, amongst other things. Similarly, green means new life in Asia, but death in Latin. So be very conscious of the colors you're using in your branding and even the dates when you're doing certain things, because they may have cultural nuances and context that you could either leverage for your benefit or could actually really harm whatever you're planning to do. And finally, with the cultural nuances, NPS. So not all NPS is equal. Net Promoter Score, eight in one country isn't the same eight in another. So for example, if we to compare the UK and the US, in the UK, people are NPS scores are likely to be higher if it's anonymous than if it's not. So these are things to take into consideration. Best practices for localization. Please don't hard code, and this is for your own benefit. When you're hard coding a language or cultural nuances, it means that you are increasing your technical debt, because now rather than just having to worry about, let's say, your platform in English, you also now have to worry about the Spanish platform as well. And if there's any changes, you have to change on both. Instead, you should use dynamic keys, and this is where the handoff part with especially human translators comes into play. So you want to make sure and think about what integrations they're using, because the whole premise is you should have a database whereby if you just change the source key, everything changes in the translated versions as well, and that's automatically populated into your platform rather than you having multiple platforms you have to manage and worry about. There are a lot of open source libraries as well that you can leverage for cultural nuances. So CLDR by Unicode is the one I've used the most. Be careful with this. It tends not to be as good for emerging markets. So from my experience, it's not as good for places like India and Southeast Asia. So bear that in mind. For apps, so localization is different depending on what platform you're using. So Android and Apple have a lot of localization functionality. Use this. It will make your life a lot easier. Whereas for websites and web apps, you have to build a lot of your own localization nuances yourself using these open source libraries that I mentioned. Think about A/B testing for copy in different languages. So just because it's now translated in French doesn't mean that you've optimized that translation for your needs. Just as you would A/B test certain CTAs in English, do in other languages as well. User testing with translators is also really key. Please do user testing in other markets. Just because something is right in one market doesn't mean it's right in another. Different markets have different expectations of what they want and need from a product. They have different design systems that they're used to and design norms as well. And this is really important for you to pick this up. And finally, English is just another language is something we use at one of the last companies I worked at. And the whole idea is if English is scored at 1 and 1 is the base, how are your other languages and not languages, sorry, that was a mistake, but how your other locales experiences in comparison, right? So really you want all of your locales to be at least 0.8 in comparison to that 1, which English is. So let's move on. Design. So when people think about localization, they think of all these nuances, but they forget that one of the fundamental aspects is design. That comes before you can get translations done in many ways. So design and locale, not all languages are equal in length. So if English is the base, Chinese and Japanese is 15% reduction, 50% reduction in length. Korean is a 30% reduction in length. French and Italian increases text by 30%, and Dutch and German increases text by 50%. So when you're designing, you need to think of, okay, if we translate into this language, how will the spacing change? And also, have you designed your product with RTL in mind? Remember, not everything flips. So, for example, symbols don't flip, imagery doesn't necessarily flip. You need to be thinking about these things as well. Some currencies are also longer. So, for example, one USD equals approximately 81 Indian rupees. So, think about that when it comes to spacing. And on top of that, the other important thing when it comes to currency is I know sometimes we may say in the West 1K or 1G representing 1,000. Please avoid doing that from a localization perspective, because what will happen is you could then translate that K, and that doesn't 1K in whatever language does not have any meaning that we associate it with. And another thing is thinking about the ease of changing locale settings. So this is especially true and important on web platforms, because yeah, you as a user, you want to be able to easily say, okay, if someone has accidentally shown me French, I need to now easily be able to change it to British English. Similarly, when it comes to apps, actually you get a lot of the data from the platform, right, from Apple or Android, to know what languages this person uses on the device or have selected for the device. And my advice is, especially for your app, only push to that user the languages that they have on their device. Don't push all languages. It's just makes the app clunky. It means that they have to download more. It takes up more storage space, memory, etc. And with webs platforms or websites, you can get that information also from usually the search engine, as well as the IP address, to have a sense of what locale settings you should be showing them. An important thing within design, though, is that you can test all of this even before you've committed any code or launched a product. So there's something called pseudo locales, or pseudo translations. Google has a variety of these, and what these are is they're fake languages, but they mean that you can test different lengths, different texts, different fonts really well. So Google, I think, has about three. They have one for right to left, they have one for Latin-based languages, and they have one for languages that use more traditional Chinese characters, etc. So test these as part of your development process to see if what you've built actually can be localized easily. And also, this is available in Figma. There's plugins that can put pseudo locales and translations into your designs. So Smartlin is one, and that's available in Figma and Adobe. And it just means that before you've even committed any code, you know whether your product can be localized or not. One thing to note, though, is when it comes to design, is think about your font stack. Not all fonts support all characters in every language. So this is something I was really aware of when I was doing Arabic. So a lot of the common ones or default ones on platforms didn't support every character in Arabic, and so we had to go and find and adapt our font stack so that we could also have ensure that we had a supported font for every word and character in Arabic. And so there is, for Arabic, there's a free one that I think Microsoft created in partnership with Dubai that you can use. But yeah, design is really important when it comes to localization. Don't forget it. Now let's get into the specific nuances for Web3 on and off ramps. So just to provide that definition, on ramps is when you're going from fiat to crypto. Off ramps are when you're going from crypto to fiat. And on and off ramps are fundamental. You can't, they define how people can access and whether they can access the world of crypto and Web3. How can someone, engage or buy your token if they don't have the right on and off ramps for their market? And so there's loads of different aspects with on and off ramps that you should take into consideration. One is local payment methods and information. So have you got the correct integration? So M-Pesa is really big and important in Kenya. If you're doing Kenya, have you got M-Pesa integrations? Union Pay is a Chinese payment network, Chinese created payment network, and is important in parts of Southeast Asia as well. Boleto Bancario, apologies for any Portuguese speakers, I know that was horrendous, but it's really important in Brazil. So think about all these current or making sure that you have the correct integrations, and if you're using any on and off ramp provider, that they have the right integrations as well for the markets that are important to you. Another nuance is required information. So they could have the right integrations, but they don't have the right fields. So, for example, when you're paying or doing a bank transfer in Nigeria, all you need is the person's or the company's account number and bank name. In the UK, in comparison, it's a sort code and account number. In some countries, they put last name first and first name second. Payment addresses, some countries don't have zip codes or postcodes, right? So you don't want to have that field having to be full because it's not applicable to every country. When it comes to payment addresses, Google has had one of the more comprehensive databases, especially for doing pre-filling of addresses, but it still had its flaws. So bear that in mind as well when you're thinking about on and off ramping partners. And finally, payment behaviors. So in Brazil, for example, for larger payments, there's a cultural preference and tendency for it to be paid in the form of installments on a month by month basis. So that's something to think about whether if you're targeting Brazil, is that something you should bake into your product? And then also, I did say before, I mentioned a term and I wanted to explain it to you, which is P2P on and off ramps. So not all on and off ramps are direct. It's not possible everywhere. So welcome to the world of P2P. So the largest P2P market in the world, according to Chainalysis' crypto adoption report of 2021, was Kenya. But it's also important in places like Nigeria. In the context of Nigeria, the government regulation has meant that direct on and off ramps aren't possible. And by direct on and off ramps, I mean the ability to buy, for example, crypto with your card, as in the West or in the UK at least, we're able to do. So how it works is that you have P2P or peer-to-peer, and there's two different ways you can approach peer-to-peer. One is having escrow accounts, and that's what I built something that use this method. And so in an escrow account peer-to-peer network, you have merchants, they're the liquidity providers, they set the terms of trade, and what happens is a user comes onto the platform, they determine a merchant they want to trade with. The crypto is then moved into an escrow account that we or the platform controls. And then off the platform, a fiat transaction takes place. And so that's, for example, me simply sending money to your bank account is a fiat transaction. And then both parties come back onto the platform and confirm that the fiat transaction has taken place. The escrow, as a result, the crypto is then released from escrow as a result. Another way of approaching P2P on and off ramps is through vouchers and virtual cards. So you send fiat to a specific bank account or wallet or whatever, and then this amount that you've sent is then converted into a voucher or a virtual currency on the platform, and you can use this to buy whatever crypto you want. App sizes and data. App sizes. Now, this is really important. So one thing to think about is who are the major phone developers in the markets you're looking at. So for example, in Africa, Transsion is the major phone developer. It controls, I think, about 48% of the market, or the most recent statistics. Is there a way you can work with them? Can you think about how their platforms work? And can you integrate with them better? Also, don't forget there are dumb smartphones in this world, right? So this is something that the likes of KaiOS is really leading and pioneering. They're doing especially well in India from what I last saw. So think about that when you're developing your product, right? There are also light versions of apps for a reason. So this is something that especially the likes of Facebook or now Meta pioneered with Instagram Lite, Facebook Lite, WhatsApp Lite. I think the first was launched back in 2017 or 2018. Now the difference between Insta Lite and normal Instagram is that it is smaller, right? So it's 2 MB versus 80 MB. It's less heavy load, it requires lower storage amounts. It's also adapted the product so that it's better for smaller screens. And so it's targeting those people on low RAM Android phones because Instagram in particular found that their normal app was too slow and buggy. They scaled back the design as well to make it really simple. And there's actually an excellent article by Meta, by Design on at Meta, that was published published on Medium earlier this year that talks about how they thought about Instagram Lite. And also another thing that Instagram thought about was using different terms. So feed was viewed as something different, as to mean something different. Um, in emerging markets, in some emerging markets, it is viewed to mean home, right? And that's not what it's meant to mean. And so these are things that you should think about when you're developing your app, and especially when you're thinking about developing an app for emerging markets and think about who you're trying to target. Similarly, data usage is important. So GSMA found that in Africa in 2021, only 2.9 gigabytes of data was used a month. In comparison, the global average is 12 gigabytes per month, which personally I don't use anywhere near, but I'm sure there's apparently loads of people out there who use a lot of data per month. In 2027, this is meant to evolve. Africa average is meant to be 11 gigabytes per month, and the global average is meant to be 40 gigabytes per month. But you can still see there's this huge divergence. So think about how data intensive your platform or product is, and how you can make that lighter. So you could also do an approach like Facebook did in Kenya, where they partnered with telecoms in Kenya, and so that you could use Facebook without photos and videos, without using any of your data, your personal data. So these are things to think about when you're thinking of emerging markets. And then finally, we have positioning and the value of money. So money. There's different financial systems globally. So we might be used to Western banking, but don't forget that there's also Sharia compliant or Islamic financing, and in that financial modeling, interest can't be used in the same way, or can't be used at all, as we're used to in the West or in Western banking. And that means that yield farming isn't accessible to those who adhere to Sharia compliant banking. And just to put into perspective, last year the Islamic banking, which is one aspect of Sharia compliant financing, was worth over 2 trillion US dollars. There's also different utilities and needs. So let's take stablecoins as an example. When I'm thinking from a Western perspective, to be honest, I have no use case for USD stablecoins personally. I'm sure there's some people in the West who do. But when you think from an emerging market perspective, I can see there's strong use cases, because in many emerging markets, there's capital controls. So it's difficult for people to access foreign currencies such as USD or GBP. Um, there's also facts that, unfortunately, many emerging market currencies face significant devaluation against the USD. And so they want to be able to access and store their money in something like USD or GBP or Euro. And so there's different utilities that you can play into and that you can use when it comes to positioning in your product in different markets. There's also the Tanzanian case. So when I was working in Tanzania for telecom, one of the interesting things that we found was that we were trying to push this use case of, hey, use mobile money, because then you don't have to physically go to collect that money or exchange that money, etc. Or you don't have to go to an ATM to withdraw money if it is transferred via bank. But that wasn't an enticing use case or need or problem in the context of the Muslim population in Tanzania, specifically in Zanzibar. They didn't find, for example, the time taken to travel to collect the money as a waste of time or a loss of time. And so these are things that you have to think about, and really understand the markets you're trying to target. And most importantly, meet people where they are. Like, crypto, as I said, there's still friction, there's jargon, there's a lot of apprehension from some people. So you want to make it as easy as possible for people to use and want to use crypto or Web3. So meet people where they are, meet them at their behaviors, use design systems that they're used to. And then the final point within this money and positioning is there's different values to money. So $10 for me doesn't seem like a lot, but for some people in emerging markets, that's a lot of money. And that also applies to when you're thinking about gas fees, right? And when you're thinking about what blockchain you're building on top of. Some have very high gas fees, which will make it very difficult for them to scale currently into emerging markets where the value of money just has different connotations attached to it. And this also applies to when you're thinking about projects, right? So, for example, if you have an NFT project and it's $1,000 to mint the NFT, that makes it inaccessible for a lot of people. And we shouldn't necessarily count these people out, because there are micropayments which when you accumulate it, are huge. There's a reason why microfinancing is a fairly successful industry in places like Bangladesh. Well, that was really the birthplace of it and has now expanded to other parts of the world. So, I guess to take a step back, fundamentally, there are a few things you need to think about. When it comes to building your product, your Web3 product or crypto project, make sure you're not just assuming that, okay, it's Web3, so it applies globally. It doesn't. It did that mentality didn't work in Web 2, and it's definitely not going to work in Web 3. So if you truly want to have a global Web3 product, this workshop hopefully has outlined the things that you need to think about when you're building your product. And so the question I have for you is, are you truly ready? Is your product truly ready to cross the crypto chasm? Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Gmail, on email rather, sorry, at maya@nestcoin.com. I'm here to answer any questions you have and help in whatever way possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maya. That was a great presentation. Um, Feel free, if you have any questions, to drop them in the chat. We can post them up here and then Maya can answer them. In the meantime, I guess just one question that I have for you
Mhm.
is like, what are some of the biggest challenges you face personally when kind of managing the building of global products, specifically in the space, in the Web3 space?
I think it's one is just getting everyone in the company to buy into it, into
Mhm.
localization and internationalization, because it's not enough for just the C-suite or the senior people and managers. The individual engineers, the individual designers need to have it at the forefront of their mind when they're going about their daily work. Um, that is a massive challenge, and as any company, you have to make sure that everyone buys into it and gets the importance. And there's loads of different activities you can do. So, for example, try translating your app into really a foreign language, right? Maybe translate it into Arabic and see how people react and respond and manage with it. Um,
Mhm.
I think another challenge is really the on and off ramping part. Um, Building an on and off ramp for a non-custodial on and off ramp for Africa really made me appreciate how fundamental that is and how there's just not enough people really thinking about it. And it kind of is the base layer of Web3. It's probably the base layer which may not be spoken about enough because everyone's, caught up in GameFi or DeFi or NFTs. But if you don't have the correct on and off ramps, you're making it 10 times harder for people to access. Um, I think the other thing also is for those crypto Web3 products that do use KYC in some form, being really mindful of the KYC provider you use. Even for myself, from personal experience, I can say that there have been many projects, platforms I've tried to access. Um, and even with my British passport and ID, I had trouble and I just essentially gave up. And I'm someone who's crypto native. So imagine if you really want to cross a chasm, you've lost a lot of people over something very simple that shouldn't be too complicated. And I think the final point is just having those open conversations and learning and exposing yourself to new markets and people and ways of building. And by doing that, you'll start to appreciate it. It'll start to bake in naturally into the way of being. I'm very fortunate to have worked in different markets, and so I naturally have that sort of mindset. But not everyone does, and there's ways you can cultivate that and create that without having to work abroad as well.
Awesome. I guess also, do you have any tips for like product managers who are like new to localization, new to building global products? Tips to really get buy-in and also make sure that people are thinking about all the aspects that you've mentioned in your presentation when building their product.
So in terms of getting buy-in, you need to have firstly, even though it's not everything, you need to have exact buy-in and you need to have them also actively pushing it. Um, the other thing is just getting people to test your product, like getting the engineers or designers on a call with testers in other markets, get them to really feel and understand the challenges that people are facing by using their product. Get, even as I said, do something a bit different, like get your product translated into another language and get people to try and use it. And then those, like people like me who are English speakers, you start to appreciate the difficulties of using something that isn't in a language that you're used to. um, all these things, right, get people to empathize with the challenges that other markets may face. um, and that's probably the best way to get buy-in, from my experience.
Awesome. So we have a question from the chat.
Mhm.
I believe Alessandro, sorry if I messed up the pronunciation, but Alessandro asks, what tool um, do you give advice for developers to implement in their decentralized app to support localized language out of the box?
Tool. So I'm assuming you mean like translation. So to be honest, um, as I said, there's machine and human translation. If you're going down a machine translation route, there is there are nuances with Web3, but a lot of it is also applicable from Web2. Um, Google Translate, I think, is actually really excellent. Use Google Translate, and more importantly, use their pseudo locales as well when it comes to developing. They're available on Google. You can integrate them into your product as well as part of your development process, and they help you appreciate not just the language and the spacing and whatnot, but also like some cultural nuances that you should think about. Those are the key things that I would recommend. But there's the platform also to find good machine translation platforms and providers is Inten. It's spelled INTEN, and that's a really good way to just get a general review of what's in the market and what you can use for your specific use cases.
Awesome. Thank you. I hope that answered your question. And I think I have one last question in terms, because I know that you mentioned like NFT projects, and I know NFT projects have been really huge in the space, especially in the height of, NFTs. And a lot of them do have global communities, but are created more from like a Western lens. So just kind of like, what tips would you give to creators who are creating NFT projects in terms of like making sure that they're appealing on a global level and not just to like Western buyers or collectors?
So it's really important that you are testing your product, engage in understanding the needs of non-Western collectors. Like, do user research, like engage with people who in the markets you want to target, ask them the right questions. Um, my personal guidebook for like just thinking of how to ask the right question is the Mums Test. I think is an excellent, very short book. Um, and I think apart from that, it is also, as you said, these communities very much are built from the West, English speaking Western perspective. They may, at most, sometimes you'll see the odd community which will have, let's say, Discord channels, which are for other languages. But in reality, just as you need for the English speaking channels, you need people dedicated building that community up and making sure people continue to be engaged. And so whether that means having someone in the team who can speak those languages, or having an advocate from the community who really is passionate about your product, who can really take a lead on that, that's really important. Communities are fundamental to Web3, and unfortunately most of the content from communities is written in English and English alone. And so, if you go into Discord, there's very few projects that are meant to be global in nature that support anything other than English in their community chats. Um, and the ones that do try to do more just have a language channel which says, "Hey, X project French or X channel French." And that's not really sufficient. Just as you wouldn't say, hey, X channel English, off you go, English speakers, have fun. You do more. You try and build a community. You have people who are activating that community and engaging that community. And that's also really important when you're thinking about communities for other markets as well. And as I said, that imagery and color point is so fundamental. So an old school example is Nokia produced a phone line and they came up with a name, launched it in Spain, or were about to launch it and realized that the name in Spanish means prostitute. And
Okay.
very, very simple mistake, very simple oversight. Just be mindful of things like that. Um, so just make sure you engage and are speaking to those users outside of just the English speaking West, especially markets that you're interested in.
Awesome. Thank you. Because I know a lot of NFT project creators do struggle with that. So I think that's really important. So we have two more questions.
Sure.
We have a question from PJ. So PJ said, as a PM, I found that the team is always stretched too thin to focus on certain things. Other than building empathy for the customer, what tips do you have to get the team to understand importance?
I think, to be honest, um, the other one is using raw data. So when I was pitching to the C-suite that we needed to expand into Arabic, I crunched a lot of data with some other members of the team at my last company, and I did a massive presentation. I went on a roadshow essentially to different teams, and I was like, "Hey, this is why Arabic is important. Here is the data that shows that it's important now. It's only going to be more important," and also focus them a bit. So in the context of Arabic is spoken in many countries. There's also 4 different variations of the Arabic language, and so make sure you focus people. And so in my case, it was okay. These are the top 2 Arabic-speaking markets we're focusing on, and this is a variation of Arabic that we're supporting, and the rest will come later. Um, and so those are really important. People hopefully are data driven, and it's hard to argue with the facts, and it's hard to argue with how that will positively impact the bottom line. So things like that, and then also especially if you're thinking about, okay, we need to improve this product for this market, understand and really scope out what's wrong with that the product in that market currently, and then starting to understand like the costs of making changes. So that's what I also did, right? So I got a really small budget to do Google Translate or translate the content into Arabic roughly, and then managed to get people to test. The product in Arabic across all platforms, and because got detailed feedback across all the products, all the platforms. I said, okay, for us to then fix this or do these are the critical changes that we need to make. These are the nice to have, etc. And therefore, here are the teams that would need to make these changes. Here's how much, like if we were to story point it, here's how much it would take from a story point perspective to do. And that also helped with pushing people to say, okay, actually, this is what needs to be done. This is why it's important from a numerical, like figures, P&L perspective.
Awesome. Thank you for that question, PJ, and thank you, Maya. And then we have a question from Yemi. So Yemi said, "Hi, Maya. Could
I
you
mean,
speak about the most rewarding part of developing new processes for emerging markets?"
oh, I just love learning about different cultures. To be honest, it changes the way you think and do things. It means that you can empathize with people, not just from different cultures, but just people better because you understand and appreciate that your worldview is a product of your experiences, and that it's not necessarily the right or the only view out there. And so, one thing that's really rewarding is when you really realize that it's this really small thing, or there's just a completely different way of viewing things. Um, that you just didn't realize. So in the example I gave before with Tanzania was just really fundamental. Whereas in the likes of Kenya, even they were able to push this convenience aspect and time saving aspect, realizing that that didn't work in the context of the Muslim population, especially in Zanzibar and Tanzania, was just earth shattering because it meant that the way you were promoting that product just you had to change it. And that's really rewarding when you notice that small nuance that makes a huge difference to your product and the way people experience it. And just hearing people like, oh my gosh, I remember when we launched a product in Arabic and people were so excited. They were like, finally there's this big Western company that's really paying attention to us. And that's a nice feeling to just recognize people, because unintentionally in the world we do tend to prioritize English speaking West, and I think everyone is due respect and recognition. And in a small way, by localizing your product, you are showing that you're almost paying homage to that culture and those people, and recognizing them and their nuances as well. So that is really, really rewarding. And there's so much, and it pays off. Like if you're in China, there's cultures of when you're eating food, right? If you're senior, you typically go like that. If you're more junior, you're meant to go like that. There's so much nuance and wealth in different cultures that you just don't appreciate, and you learn through just experience and exposure and asking those questions and being open-minded, of course.
Awesome. Thank you. So that was our last question. Again, I want to thank you so much, Maya, for presenting today. Did you have any final thoughts or anything that you want to say before we end today?
I mean, thank you so much for having me. It's super exciting also to know that Developer DAO is building a project manager functionality or division. It's very important. And I guess my final thought is to the crypto bros, sisters out there. I fundamentally believe that utility for most crypto projects is really in the emerging market. So start building with those users in mind, for sure. And that's my key thought. And of course, if you have any questions, any further points, here's my contact details.
Awesome. We have your Twitter, but let me put up your contact details. So, yep, you can email Maya at nestcoin.com or follow Maya on Twitter. And also, if you want to keep up with any future Developer DAO product management workshops, feel free to follow Developer DAO on Twitter. And we will be posting updates of our workshops for next month. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.